Whites who migrated to present-day Oregon during the 1840s and 1850s typically were very much against slavery, but they were simultaneously against living with black folks. On September 21st, 1849, the territorial legislature passed a law that said, "It shall not be lawful for any Negro or mulatto to enter into or reside in Oregon." The preamble to the law indicated that Negroes might intermix with Indians, instilling into their minds feelings of hostility towards the white race. Now, I guess this presumes that the native population didn't have any independent reasons for having hostility towards the white race. The clause was rendered moot by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, but it was not actually repealed until 1926, and other infelicitous language was removed from Oregon's charter in 2002. But let me say this, even though this law that was passed in 1849 was not ferociously enforced, it was relatively effective. As of 1860, the census indicates that there were 128 black people living in Oregon out of a population of 52,465. And today, blacks constitute about 2% of Oregon's population. You've probably heard references to the phenomenon of sundown towns. These are towns where black folks had best be out of the town by the time the sun goes down. I've also used that phrase metaphorically to describe academic departments that have never had a black faculty member. I refer to them as sundown academic departments. But what's intriguing about Oregon is Oregon constituted a sundown state. And so I just wanted to indicate that we had a sundown state in the far northwest, and this is a region of the country that could not necessarily be more physically distant from the southern part of the United States. So let me begin the conversation with a series of indictments. The first indictment must be the failure to fulfill the promise of the grant of 40 acres and a mule to families who had been enslaved. Had that promise been made, had the ex-slaves been given a substantial endowment in southern real estate, it is likely that there would be no need for reparations to be under consideration today. The 40 acres were to be allocated roughly to families of 4. Therefore, each ex-slave should have received 10 acres of land. Since there were approximately 4 million ex-slaves, a total of 40 million acres of land should have been allocated to the formerly enslaved black community.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. Now there's something that I think that we need to address is what's the state of black Americans 200 years, 300 years, 150 years after the emancipation? Because we all know what happened. And you ask ourselves, has things changed? Because you can literally hear some people come out and say that black Americans usually complain about everything playing, trying to be victims instead of taking up spaces and just being like anybody else, right? And now this American professor is going to explain why I feel like still black people need to complain about this, because it's important for them to complain, because there are a couple of things that haven't happened as it should be, right? And somebody has to step and talk about this, because I feel like it's really important as a subject of talking about, because usually people always brushes off this thing by saying that, oh, you know, black people, you keep on complaining, right? And there are a couple of things that I think are accompanied by the talks that the professor is trying to talk about. Like black people were promised 40 acres and a mule, which didn't happen, right? Black Americans, land ownership issues, and these are factors that are happening until today. When we ask ourselves, what's the plight of black people in the United States today, after 300 years, after 400 years of emancipation, right? And now we're also going to be seeing or talking about black and white land ownership? What's the disparities between black and white ownership that I feel like this professor is going to address in the same video? And I think that these are discussions that we need to have, because people like Candace Owens, usually they're so harsh on black people who are always trying to talk about reparations, who are always trying to talk about slavery and its effect till today. Because remember, people, most of the things that you're seeing in the United States today are as a result of things that came into play during slavery. And some of them majorly have affected black people in a negative way. And so I think the main purpose of this video is to address the issues, or to address this group of people who usually say that black people, you need to stop complaining, or you need to wake up and work hard just like any other person, without understanding that there are a couple of systemic issues that are affecting black people that I feel like we need to address, that are really, really important. And one of them is we have to talk about the Ku Klux Klan, the brutal attacks to black people, right? And elimination of black political authority, or black participation generally in everything. This is what they were trying to do to black people. And so I don't want to say much. I just want to let you watch the video, and then I'll be back. We'll talk about it a little bit.
Now, while the allocation of 40 acres was not actually made, black American farmers managed to amass 16 to 19 million acres of land by dint of their own efforts by 1910. Still less than half the amount the ex-slaves should have received during Reconstruction, but not insubstantial. This was a peak of ownership by black farmers in the United States, with 218,000 farmers as full or partial owners of land. By 1997, black farm land ownership had diminished to a mere 2.4 million acres. Today, the top 5 white landowners in the United States own more land than the whole of black America's population, and apparently Ted Turner alone possesses the equivalent of 1/4 of the entire acreage of land in the possession of black Americans. Murders of African American landowners for the purpose of appropriating their property and the coerced public sale of family land resulted in the rapid decline of black American land ownership in the 20th century, and it continues to decline further in the 21st century. Now, the failure to grant the ex-slaves an initial stake in American property ownership and subsequent sustained land taking from blacks has contributed to the comprehensive denial of black wealth accumulation. Apart from the barriers to land ownership, black home ownership was restricted by discriminatory redlining, differential access to government finance for home mortgages, and most recently by the subprime mortgage crisis engendered by loan pushing by the banking system. So not only were blacks not given the promised 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War ended, but a white terror campaign that included assassinations of black elected officials, freedmen, and their white allies throughout the South prevented blacks from exercising their right to vote. A black state senator and prominent delegate to the post-Civil War South Carolina Constitutional Convention, Benjamin F. Randolph, a staunch advocate of black suffrage and education, and the publisher and co-editor of the Charleston Advocate, a newspaper for freedmen, was executed by the Ku Klux Klan at a train depot in Hodges, South Carolina in 1868. The Klan executed white North Carolina State Senator John W. Stevens in a courthouse in Yanceyville in 1870. Stevens had been a member of both the Republican Party and the Union League. A former Confederate, Stevens's efforts to organize blacks in Caswell County, North Carolina, obviously inflamed the white supremacists. These attitudes produced the conditions for an intense and systematic level of white supremacist political violence throughout the states of the former Confederacy. This was particularly true in the states where Republican Party dominance persisted as late as 1874, almost a decade after the end of the war. These states were Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, and Mississippi. Terrorist white supremacy organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts, emerged and became brutally active across the South, intent upon restoring the old racial hierarchy. Intimidation of black voters with gun and noose became the norm. By 1876, when Union troops were removed entirely from the southern states, the die was cast. With rare exception, the right to vote was quashed for blacks, leading Bennett to conclude, Leron Bennett to conclude, soon the Civil War would be sucked of all meaning and would become an agency of reconciliation between the North and the South. Political intimidation, economic exclusion, and the erasure of communities where blacks had attained some measure of affluence were the customary aims of a wave of massacres conducted by whites from the 1870s well into the 1940s. Among the very earliest in the post-Civil War period were the Memphis riot of 1866, the brutal attacks conducted by the White League in Colfax in 1873 and Coushatta in 1874 in Louisiana. The White Riot in Danville, Virginia took place in 1883, followed by an even more destructive bloodbath that took place 2 years after Plessy, the 1898 massacre in Wilmington, North Carolina. Planned in advance and systematically encouraged by white supremacist agitation, the goal of the Wilmington massacre was the overthrow of the Republican-elected municipal government. The plotters were drawn from the best social class of the city's white people, most visibly including Alfred Waddell, a former Confederate Army colonel who installed himself as mayor after the uprising. In all of these cases, local police forces were implicated as agents of violence and extermination directed against blacks. In all of these cases, there was some direct or indirect attempt to eliminate black political authority or black political participation altogether from the process of decision-making in these municipalities. White supremacists who fomented the Atlanta riot that took place in September 1906 and led to dozens of black deaths patterned their vigilante assault explicitly after the tactics pursued by the conspirators in Wilmington. In 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois was engulfed by white destruction. And in the aftermath of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, the grisly Red Summer of 1919 witnessed murderous assaults on black communities in dozens of towns and cities, including Elaine, Arkansas, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Virginia, Omaha, Nebraska, Charleston, South Carolina, and Bisbee, Arizona. The horrific 1921 massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, raised the prosperous black Greenwood community, a so-called Black Wall Street, and included the dropping of incendiary devices on black homes and businesses. The White Riot, depicted in the 1997 film Rosewood, took place in 1923 in a small town of the same name. But the white violence in Rosewood was only one of many instances in the bloody state of Florida during the first 2 decades in the 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, America was characterized by a long and extensive lynching trail, a pathway of extra-legal executions of blacks. The most recent estimates place the number of blacks murdered by white gangs and mobs between 1877 and 1950 at close to 4,000 in the states of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. Kentucky, the only one among the 12 where enslaved persons represented less than 25% of its overall population, was the only state among these that did not secede from the Union. And these numbers of lynchings of blacks do not include approximately 300 more that took place outside of the South. Occasionally, lynching frenzies overlapped with white massacres. For example, 237 blacks were lynched in Elaine, Arkansas during the 1919 White Riot. At times, lynchings also were associated directly with the expropriation of black-owned land, and the threat of lynching also created a climate of intimidation that promoted black subordination. Although there are still numerous instances of extrajudicial executions conducted by private citizens, today's lynching trail is dominated by police killings of unarmed black men and women. Among the approximately 1,000 persons now killed by the police each year, 1/4 are Black Americans, a proportion far greater than their presence in the overall population. This annual level of Black executions exceeds virtually the number of lynchings in any year of the first half of the 20th century. A common attribute of all of these murders is the failure to convict the perpetrators of a crime. Rarely are they even prosecuted. Indeed, there is an unbroken pattern of failed prosecution of perpetrators, from the clandestine murder of Emmett Till to the execution of Michael Brown in the streets of Missouri. The ongoing destruction of comparatively affluent Black communities no longer is achieved by white riots, but by a more subtle form of violence. First, urban renewal, and second, gentrification. Both processes have been described sarcastically as Negro removal. Black neighborhoods produced under the constraints imposed by white preferences for residential segregation often develop stable, middle-income communities and Black-owned business districts. Nevertheless, these Jim Crow neighborhoods still have been subjected to demolition. Indeed, in the specific case of Miami, Florida, where we've seen the film Moonlight describing Liberty City is actually a part of what's called the Overtown District. And the Overtown District was bisected by a federal highway, which destroyed the character of the community, and it also eliminated a substantial business district there. This was not an uncommon experience. The Federal Interstate Highway Program also was deployed to situate new freeways that ran through the heart of Black communities, again, disrupting established neighborhoods, displacing residents, and destroying Black-owned business districts. This happened north, south, east, and west in the United States. Now, while urban renewal constituted a process of Negro removal engineered by the public sector, gentrification constitutes a process of Negro removal engineered by the private sector with public sector complicity. Gentrification involves the displacement of low and moderate income Blacks from neighborhoods where they have lived for generations by affluent whites. In many instances, whites are, in quotes, reclaiming America's inner cities. This process frequently is coupled with the demolition of the high-rise public housing buildings that were built after the leveling of Black-owned single-detached homes, the substitution of public and low-income housing with mixed-income housing, and the continued designation of predominantly Black communities as areas that require economic renewal and development. In short, the Black population literally is pushed out of their homes and neighborhoods. Another dimension of the indignities that are visited upon Black Americans are associated with the mechanisms of segregation. One of the examples of segregation, and there are multiple, but one of the examples was the construction of separate water fountains. So a few years ago, we did a major project comparing the status of Blacks in the United States with Dalits and tribals in India. And so sometimes I refer to Dalits and tribals as in India as the Blacks of India, but sometimes I refer to Black Americans in the United States as the untouchables of America. And there's a clear pattern that's quite similar. In the Indian context, the local village well is a contested territory, and the Dalits are frequently denied access to the water from the local village well. And so this is actually a very similar kind of pattern that occurred in the United States. Now, the question I want to pose is, I think we're familiar now with the concept of microaggressions. The question I want to pose is whether or not this is a macroaggression or a microaggression. Okay. Let's define a microaggression as an indignity that's visited upon folks where their life and limb are not directly threatened. So the primary objective and effect is to damage your emotional spirit. Okay. So we could have a series of these microaggressions, all associated with the way in which segregation would operate, which could have the cumulative effect of truly damaging individuals' health. And we're now absolutely convinced that the higher levels of hypertension that are present in the African American community are primarily attributable to racialized stress. And this is a foundation point for the kinds of racialized stress that continues to operate today. But another profound dimension of the devaluation of black lives that has been the direct product of public policy is the maintenance of separate and unequal schools. The formal structure of Jim Crow schooling did not end until 1954 with the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board decision. The pursuit of massive resistance to the court's decision by the states of the old Confederacy meant that genuine school desegregation did not get underway until the 1970s. The dual school system ensured racial differences in the quality of school facilities, in teacher compensation per pupil, and in the quality of instructional materials. The magnitude of these disparities first was documented carefully by Horace Mann Bond in his classic study, The Education of the Negro in the American Social Order. And Horace Mann Bond was Julian Bond's father. Bond detailed the widespread practice of paying black teachers significantly less than white teachers. Frequently under the dual system, the black-white teacher ratio of teacher salaries was 60% or less. These huge disparities in teacher pay could not be explained fully by differences in teacher training. The economic historian Robert Margo has estimated that both in 1910 and 1940, about 80% of the difference in black and white teacher pay was due to sheer racial differences in compensation established on pay schedules by local white-dominated school boards. This was out-and-out discrimination. But at least as pernicious are patterns of within-school segregation that result in the assignment of black students to the least challenging and least engaging curricula and instruction. Racialized tracking is the culprit. Indeed, teachers, particularly white teachers who function as the primary gatekeepers in gifted identification, are less likely to refer black students for gifted programs than white students with similar levels of academic achievement. The persistence of wage and employment discrimination and racial wealth inequality ensures that America's die are loaded against blacks in two ways. Not only do blacks have reduced opportunities to obtain quality education, but there is less of a payoff for any credential that they earn. Racial differences in earnings for MBA recipients from the same schools grow to enormous levels over a short span of time. For example, black MBAs from the Harvard Business School start their post-degree careers earning about $5,000 less than their white peers. Within 6 to 8 years of graduation, the racial pay differential approaches $100,000. Bloomberg data demonstrates that the industry in which pay is most inequitable by race and gender is finance. Tony business schools like Harvard, Columbia, and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, of course, send the largest proportion of their graduates to the financial sector. A recent audit study of more than 1,000 positions advertised on a national job search website using racialized names is especially revealing. Despite the fact that a credential from an elite, highly selective university improves the employer response rate, white candidates from less selective schools received as strong a response rate as black candidates from more selective schools. In addition, when employers did respond, they offered black candidates lower initial salaries and lower status positions than white candidates with comparable or even inferior educational credentials. Moreover, blacks with a college degree have a mere 2/3 of the median net worth held by whites who never finished high school, and blacks who are working full-time have a lower median net worth than whites who are unemployed. The last thing that I'd like to mention before turning the microphone over to Derek is the phenomenon of the thoroughgoing devaluation of black lives. And I'd like to make mention of the use of black bodies for medical experimentation, starting with the development of gynecological instrumentation in the 1840s through to experiments like the one that took place in Tuskegee, where a group of black men were left untreated for syphilis for many, many years for the purposes, according to the scientists who conducted the experiment, for the purposes of enabling them to observe the progression of the disease. In 1958, when the surviving participants were given certificates of merit, even at that stage, they were not told that they had a disease for which they were not being adequately treated. And we finally had an acknowledgement and apology for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment under Bill Clinton, but of course the Bill Clinton administration trafficked heavily in symbolism, so there was no substantive compensation that was offered to any of the still living victims. And the last thing I want to mention in this context is the phenomenon of forced sterilization of black women, particularly in instances where physicians would say to women that they would not provide them with additional medical services unless they agreed to have their tubes tied, among black women who were recipients of some form of welfare from the federal government. So that this is a coercive process of sterilization, far removed from personal choice. When the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent issued their dramatic report calling for reparations for black Americans in 2016, they emphasized current injustices as well as enslavement and its long-term effects. As the Washington Post reported, in particular, the legacy of colonial history, enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge, as there has been no real commitment to reparations and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent, the report stated. Contemporary police killings and the trauma that they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. I would go a step further. I'd say they are exactly analogous with the past racial terror of lynching. Citing the past year's spate of police officers killing unarmed African American men, the panel warned against impunity for state violence, which has created, in its words, a human rights crisis that must be addressed as a matter of urgency.
So I'll pick up from here. I guess I'm going to continue with a conversation around the political economy of the state of black America 150 years after emancipation. I'm going to start with an indictment of my profession, the economics profession, which I think is the intellectual thought for a lot of the policies that might exist, as well as the rhetoric around describing inequality. And then I'm going to end with a set of alternative policies that Sandy and several people in this room and I have been engaged in. So the Reverend Dr. William Barber describes economic justice as a moral imperative. The sentiment is in contrast with our emergent economic priorities around budget austerity and economic growth, which ironically are often at odds with one another, while economic equity, fairness, and human capabilities take a distant backseat. The economic profession in its so-called positivist approach and free market dogma are culpable in advancing this paradigm. This is based on a faith that markets are somehow natural, transparent, efficient, and inevitable. The belief does not give enough attention to the political actions that form and codify markets in the first place. Markets, whether they're product markets, labor markets, or financial markets, are presumed to be self-regulating. The most astute, the most valued, and the hardest workers are believed to prosper and endure, while the least astute, least valued, and laziest are presumed to receive their just rewards and simply fade away or have to do something else. These presumptions pay little attention to the roles of power and initial endowment, e.g. capital or wealth, and how that capital and power can adjust to alter the rules and structures of transactions and markets to privilege power and capital in the first place. It is silly to presume that those with power and capital are simply price takers. Particularly relevant for today, the economics profession has also fallen short in its understanding of the role of group identity, e.g. race, as it relates to material and psychological well-being. This is crucial for our understanding of the state of Black America 150 years after emancipation. For the most part, economists view group identity and prejudice as an exogenously determined binary that represents preferences, tastes, bigotry, or ignorance. It ignores the agency and benefits that individuals have in choosing and investing in a collective group identity, and how social structures may increase or decrease the value and incentives to invest in that identity. Without such an analysis, the economics profession is more than complicit in the continued trajectory of racial stratification. Nonetheless, this long trend towards inequality is not without tension. The shocking results of the past election seem to represent at least a rebellion, albeit far from a full overthrow of the current system. However, if the election is viewed from the perspective of a stratification economist or a critical race theorist, the results are less surprising. President Trump's campaign slogan of "Making America Great Again" and the signal, right, the "Make America Great Again" was a clear signal of a time when white male relative hierarchy was at its peak. His other campaign slogan was "I'm your last chance." That was with clear overtures to the pending demographic shift in which whites will no longer be a numerical majority. All of that was about codifying the property rights in whiteness. Some political pundits have offered an alternative explanation and attributed Trump's stunning victory to an economic populism. However, exit polls are not consistent with an economic populist mandate. The majority of households in the lowest income demographic group, those earning $50,000 or less, voted for Secretary Hillary Clinton, while no candidate attained a clear majority of votes in any other economic group. Granted, the less than $50,000 income bracket is the one that has the greatest proportion of non-whites. But nonetheless, this election was more about race than class. This leads to a key question with regards to the tenuous relationship between racial divisions amongst the working class and racial coalition building to address their collective worsening economic conditions. So here's the question. Are the white privilege benefits and protections that accrue to white workers as a result of exclusionary and discriminatory practices that codify the property rights in whiteness, are they greater than the reduced labor bargaining power costs that result from a smaller and more fragmented labor movement and having to compete with a reserve army of black and other subaltern unemployed workers? I think that's a key question. So two things are unambiguous from this form of racial stratification. First, black workers are made worse off. Second, the capitalist class, which is overwhelmingly white, is made better off. What is ambiguous is the position of that white working class worker. White privilege offers both psychological and material benefits, and we should recognize that. This frame fits with Herbert Blummer's 1958 thesis that race prejudice exists basically in a sense of group position rather than a set of feelings which members of one racial group have towards members of another racial group. Basically, group relative position transcends individual feelings. Some of the more tangible examples of property rights in whiteness include the fact that blacks who live in families where the head graduated from college, as Sandy pointed out, typically have less wealth than whites where the head dropped out of high school. Other examples would be Diva Pager's study, which indicates that when employers are signaled by workers that have a prior criminal record, white workers that signal that prior criminal record have a greater likelihood of callback than black workers who did not. Another indicator of the property rights in whiteness would be the fact that black expectant mothers who have a college degree have a greater likelihood of an infant mortality than white expectant mothers who dropped out of high school. But let's consider some historical trends of racial disparity. Prior to 1940, the U.S. Census did not collect wage and earnings data, but since then, there's a consensus amongst economists that there's been dramatic reductions in the black-white labor market disparity. In 1940, the typical black male earned less than 45% of what was earned by a white male worker. By 1980, that disparity had fallen such that the typical black male now earns about a little over 70% of what the typical white male earns. The explanations to explain this tremendous decline include improvements in overall labor market conditions resulting from rapid growth of the post-World War II period, particularly in manufacturing and production, the great migration of blacks away from the less prosperous southern and rural areas to more prosperous northern and urban areas, as well as an overall growth in southern wages in general, the substantial increase in both the quantity and quality of schooling for blacks, and particularly important, reductions in labor market discrimination resulting from the civil rights legislation, anti-discrimination enforcement, and affirmative action policies. Regardless of reason, this progress, at the very least, stalled by the mid-1970s. The worsening economic progress prompted economists John Brown and Richard Friedman to ask in 1992, what went wrong? So they posit two broad explanations. First, the environment for black achievement worsened, and second, the federal government priorities shifted away from a legislation and enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, which led to a heightening of labor market discrimination against black Americans. So we'd be remiss to discuss labor market disparities without mention of mass incarceration. Since 1970, there's been at least a sevenfold increase from about 200,000 to about 1.5 million inmates in state and federal prisons. And this is not counting the approximate 700,000 individuals that are in county and local jails. A disproportionate share of this incarceration are blacks. Black males make up about 6% of the U.S. population, but roughly half of the incarcerated population. And you all have probably heard that the black male lifetime likelihood of being incarcerated is about 1 in 3. Nonetheless, there's a striking paradox that's at odds with the worsening environment for black achievement argument. Why is it that high-achieving black Americans, typically measured by education, still exhibit large economic disparities relative to their white peers? There's a recent report by Janelle Jones and John Schmidt entitled "A College Degree is No Guarantee." It indicates that the unemployment rate for black recent college graduates exceeds 12% and is as high as 10% for those black graduates who have a STEM major. Over the past 40 years, regardless of education, the black unemployment rate has remained roughly twice that of white Americans, and rarely has that rate dipped below 8%. So if 8% is a demarcation of calamity, black Americans are in a perpetual state of economic crises. Turning to wealth, which is the paramount indicator of economic well-being, it's also the indicator of the most dramatic black-white inequality. We know that wealth provides financial agency over one's lives. It provides the economic security to take risk and shield against loss. It provides what the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen has referred to as a human capabilities approach to development. Basically, wealth allows individuals to be self-determining in defining and attaining their self-defined goals. So blacks make up about 13% of the U.S. population, but own less than 4% of the nation's private wealth. The absolute racial wealth gap exceeds $100,000. The typical black family owns about 8 cents for every dollar owned by the typical white family. And if we're to look at liquid assets and remove retirement savings, the typical black household has a $25 cushion to deal with any financial emergency that might occur. $25 is not enough to feed a family of 4 for one day. If we add retirement savings, it moves to $200. In essence, in spite of these enormous disparities, the presumption remains that if blacks were more responsible, made better financial decisions, and were more focused on education, they could get a good job and pursue a pathway towards economic security. In our research brief entitled "Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, Why Studying Hard and Working Hard is Not Enough for Black Americans," we demonstrate the statistics that Sandy cited to you earlier, that a black family with a college education only has 2/3 that of a white family that dropped out of high school. And furthermore, for those with a college degree, a typical white family has $180,000 in net worth. That's about 800% higher than that of a black family with a college degree. In essence, education is not the antidote for the enormous racial gaps in wealth and employment. None of this is intended to diminish the value of education. Obviously, there's clear intrinsic value to education, along with a public responsibility to give everyone a high-quality education that teaches them to synthesize and fuse information into big ideas with encouraging teachings, trained to deliver a curriculum from grade school all the way through college. Another one of our reports entitled Bootstraps Are for Black Kids, and that's with Yeonju Nam as the lead author, it documents that black parents with more limited resource display a greater inclination to provide financial support for their adult children, education, than their white counterpart. We find that the median wealth for black parents who provide financial support for their adult child is about $25,000, whereas that's substantially less than the $74,000 median value for white families that did not provide any resource for their adult child to go to college. It is a myth that black families don't value education, but also problematic is the societal overemphasis on the economic returns to education as the panacea to address socially established structural barriers of racial economic inclusion. So I'm going to quote a little bit from Barack Obama's 2013 commencement speech at Morehouse College, in which he invoked black American legacy of triumphant leaders who, without excuse, were able to overcome tremendous structural barriers and achieve great things. He says, "You now hail from a lineage and legacy of immeasurable strong men, men who bore the tremendous burdens and still laid the stones for the path on which we walk. You wear the mantle of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Ralph Bunche, Langston Hughes, George Washington Carver, Ralph Abernathy, and Thurgood Marshall, and yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These men were many things to many people, and they knew full well the role that racism played in their lives. But when it came to their own accomplishments and sense of purpose, they had no time for excuses." The president continues his inspirational speech to these elite black males at a historically black college and university by stating, "Every one of you have a grandmother or an uncle or a parent who's told you that at some point in life, as an African American, you have to work twice as hard as anyone else if you want to get by." So I'm going to make the case that that's part of the problem, because I ask, at what cost? Are there economic and health consequences associated with above normal effort for these highly educated, racially stigmatized black graduates in a context of a racially stratified America? Their physical and psychological cost of stigma, and ironically exerting individual agency, which in the context of these stigmatized environments may explain the limited role of education and income as protective factors for black Americans relative to their white peers. The added effects of stigma imposed on high-achieving blacks that threaten the relative position of the dominant white group may translate into deleterious health and economic conditions for those high-achieving blacks. The prevalence of a neoliberal and post-racial thought, both framed in the politics of personal responsibility, they emphasize things like individual agency, particularly self-investments and education, as the pathway towards economic mobility and efficient social distribution. Well, that might literally be bad for the health of black Americans. Despite the persistent and enormous racial disparities cited above, again, the public sentiment is that the civil rights period, which outlawed most forms of blatant de jure discrimination, has largely led to an elimination of structural racial barriers. Ultimately, the focus of policy as a result of this becomes the rehabilitation of the black American family to address remaining racial disparity. It is as if the passage of civil rights legislation moved us from conventional explanations of racial disparity evolving from biological to those that are now cultural determinism. This political discourse is upheld by Democrats, Republicans, blacks and whites alike. It emphasizes, again, education, motivation, and personal responsibility. The personal responsibility in post-racial discourse cited above minimizes the role of race and accentuates three things. One, the civil rights period removed, largely transcended racial divide. Two, the remaining disparities are the result of actions or inactions on the part of blacks. And three, this is the one that I think we should be cognizant of, there's nothing particular about the oppression experienced by black Americans. Some people have called this multicultural neoliberalism. And I think the president in his...
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you saw to yourself the points that the professor was trying to make. Honestly, I feel like they're really important, and they are on point, especially when trying to address factors or issues or talking about people who usually pinpoint black people for complaining or calling out things which are going on. And remember, and this is something that I always say, that everything that you're seeing today in the United States was built by blood and sweat of black people. The trauma that these people went through for all this to happen, the platform that majority of people are having today in the United States are as a result of the hard work of black people. It is the hard work that black people have put that has made this to become, a success, right? And so it can be fair, or at least fair, if we try to address these issues as black people. As your fellow African brother here, I think we always need to educate ourselves on these issues, because people, or we amongst ourselves, we take ourselves for granted for the things that, the atrocities that people have done to us. And I think the professors have tried to highlight one of the most important issues, and one is to try to demystify or try to make people understand why I feel like black people still need always to talk. And I think it's important for them to say what's always on their mind, because at the end of the day, it is them that, when we talk about these systemic issues, they're the ones who are always going through these problems. For people who think that black people are always complaining, I feel like this video was a good one for them to watch and understand that it's not even about complaining. And if it's about complaining, look at the systemic issues that are still happening until today. Like right now I'm talking to you, right? You can understand that the same problems that black folks are going through, it is the same problem that black folks in the United States until today, like right now I'm talking to you, that is still that the same problems that they are going through. And I feel like it is so unfair to pinpoint black people of playing victim, of having victim mentality. And I think that's what mostly people usually say, that black people, you have victimhood mentality and all those things. Because for me, I don't think like it's entirely a victim mentality, but I see to it like, in as much as, okay, they are victims because, yeah, as a result of transatlantic slave trade, everything happened and things change, right? And it's not like they are complaining out of nothing. It is because, look, the system which was placed is against them. And this video that I just play is trying to explain to you that you need to look at some angles that these things happens. Look at land ownership, because land is an important factor of production. And look at land ownership. Look at the percentage of blacks who own land, and look at the percentage of whites who own land, right? Because it is important to understand that all this is happening at the expense of black people. Remember, the natives of the American land, the Indians, right? They had their land with them. White people came who were not the owners of this land, and they enslaved black people in this same land. So all this makes sense when we try to discuss this at an angle of, hey, look, black people have worked so hard, till the land, but they haven't benefited from them, right? And so for me, I think that it's fair if we say that it's not okay to pinpoint black people for complaining about the atrocities that they are going through, right? And I think people's problems, maybe black people's problem differ from one person to one person. Some are grappling with police brutality, which has its history during the times of Jim Crow. Some complain about poor conditions at work, which was still an issue, still during the Jim Crow moments. Some are complaining about, there are a couple of things that black people complain that I think it needs to be addressed. And it's like the voices of black people, it's usually used to shape certain fundamental issues when putting laws in the United States, because they are the ones who have always talked about the affirmative action. They're the ones who have talked about factors to do with education, which I really, really find it so fascinating, because it's important that black voice is always heard. So I don't see at a point where somebody will wake up and say that black people are always playing the victimhood mentality. If you think that this is a lie, ask Latinos. They are a group of people who have benefited from the voices of black people. And when people say that black people are playing victimhood mentality, and that's what I would like to tell them, because it is for the voice. Because if it were not for the voice of black people, a number of things couldn't have happened. And I think that it's important, and I encourage every person who is watching this video to always share what they think, to always say what is on their mind, because at the end of the day, it's about your voice. And you know what you're going through as a black person in the United States. Sometimes you're a person who is tired of being stopped by cops on the road. You understand what I'm saying? So this is what happens. And I feel like, in as much as we might be going through different challenges as black people in the United States, but I think collectively, if people can come out and share how they feel and share what they feel, I feel like this will really, really go a long way in establishing a ground where black voices can be heard. In making this happen, we'll show the world that we also have a voice. And there are a couple of things that maybe history doesn't recognize, right? But through our voices, we can come out and, talk about this. And so as a result of that, I would like to end the video by saying it is not about playing the victimhood mentality, but it's understanding that these people faced this, these people went through this, and how did they, how is this affecting them till today, right? So rounding it up all, this video was to address a group of people who usually say that black people play victimhood mentality. I hope you find wherever you are. See you in my next video. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.